Day and welcome to this week's eNCALive debate. I'm your host, Trudy Makaya. On the 1st of June 2015, new regulations will come into place for minor children traveling in and out of South Africa. For example, parents traveling with their young children will have to produce unabridged birth certificates for them. A parent traveling alone with a child will have to provide a consent affidavit from the other parent showing that they have agreed to the specific trip that the parent and the child are undertaking. Now, to help us think through these issues, we have a panel of guests in studio with us. We will delve into what do these regulations mean for the safety and security of our country and its citizens, its economy, especially the tourism sector. Joining us, we have Megan Harrington-Johnson, an associate attorney at Schindler's Attorneys, and we have Matthew Fubbs from the Holiday Factory. And as always, we have our social media editor, Erin Marissa Bates, who will be telling us all about your comments and your questions from our social media platforms. Now, I suppose we talk about unabridged versus abridged birth certificates. There's a lot of complexity and administrative language that goes into this. Megan, if you could just break it down into what does this mean for parents, for single parents, and for guardians traveling with children?
Okay, sure. So most people don't realize that there actually are two forms of birth certificates in South Africa. There's the abridged version, which you are given immediately upon registering your child's birth. Then there's an unabridged version, which you have to apply for from the Department of Home Affairs. The abridged version will only ever show the mother's name and the child's name. The unabridged version will show the mother and father's name if the parents are married, or only the mother's name if they are single, or the mother and the father if the father consents to be on the unabridged birth certificate if they're unmarried, right? It's a little bit of a complex situation, but people need to understand that these documents do exist, and unfortunately now you are going to have to obtain your unabridged birth certificate from the Department of Home Affairs. If you're a married couple, it's generally all right because you'll both be listed on the unabridged birth certificate, and if you travel without your spouse, but with the child, you'll just have to get an affidavit from that partner. But if you're an unmarried couple and the whereabouts of your partner are unknown, but he's listed on the birth certificate, he or she, you're still going to have to get a consent affidavit, which means you're going to have to track that person down. It's going to have to be provided every time you leave the country with the child for every single trip. Same applies for orphan children or children that are in the care of their guardians, because you are then going to have to present either the death certificate of both parents or an affidavit or a court order, consenting to you being the legal guardian of the child.
So quite a stringent requirement there in terms of the documentation that you have to present. Matthew, I mean, are you seeing this? How are you preparing and gearing up for this being in the tourism industry?
Yeah, so I think the tourism industry, I think, needs to be broken down into two elements. Those that deal with South Africans travelling abroad, and then those that are dealing with the inbound tourism. So the outbound tourism travel section is a little bit simplified because it's primarily South Africans. So as Megan has said, everyone understands what an abridged birth certificate is. And all of the ASATA, your sort of regulated, established travel agencies, have for a while now, since it was, I forget the term they use, it was delayed, the implementation was delayed since September, I think, have been, through their websites, through their social media, and on their emails saying, if you're going to be traveling from 1st of June, you will require this kind of documentation.
Is it a big change given what people used to do when they traveled with
children? It's a big change because, first of all, people didn't know that there was a difference between an abridged and an unabridged. And if I stand corrected, I think up to 18 months ago, you were just getting an abridged certificate. You had to actually go and request an unabridged certificate. So there's a backlog of, 16 years if you look at it's been 2 months. So there's a lot of people who now have realized they've been told they need to get the unabridged birth certificate. They're going and applying for it because our message to them is, if you go to an airport as a South African from the 1st of June with children, regardless of where you fall and whether it's a divorced parent or such, if you don't have that required documentation, that airline is obliged to not board you. And that incurs substantial cost for the consumer. And and then you come into the collaboration between the different government departments. We have to apply it, we have to enforce it. Well, we don't enforce it, but we have to inform them of it. But they can't get the documentation in the necessary time. Some can, some can't. And that's where I foresee from 1st of June we're going to start having those kind of issues come up where people just haven't been able. And what do you do? What do you do if you can't get the unabridged birth certificate in time? So
I suppose, and as tour operators, you have to be conservative. You have to advise them and ensure that they're getting. We cannot suggest any alternative other than what's been legislated and what the document says that has to be adhered to. The inbound tourism is potentially a more, it's kind of like a put your hand in the box and you're not sure what you're going to get out, because what is an unabridged birth certificate in China? So
what is the equivalent document?
Because they ask for an equivalent document in the other country.
What is that? And it's not clear. So I think that, and we've noticed, some of my colleagues in the outbound tourism have mentioned figures of 30 to 40% cancellations in bookings, forward bookings from June onwards.
So people just thinking this is too much.
Well, they can't get they can't get the documentation. For China, for example, you have to now appear in person to get your visa, and along with the visa comes these required documentation. Now, that's fine, but there are only two places in China, Shanghai and Beijing, where they have centers where you can actually apply for it. So there's a cost now to now get just to the place where you need to get the right documentation, and do you have the right documentation? So, I think I'm not too sure how the inbound tourism companies are managing that process.
And we've heard quite a bit from the tourism industry. But before we get there, Aaron, what are people saying in terms of their concerns or questions around this?
The main concerns that I've seen on social media from our audience have been around single parents, for example. What are the limitations in terms of their traveling? We've also had some comment on whether other countries ask for the same kinds of travel documents. So we had a follower, Ben Pooler, who said this is madness. And does any other country have similar requirements? Do you know, maybe, Matt?
So I was referring to an interview that Otto de Vries from Asata did recently, where it was stated that there's no other country in the world which requires an unabridged birth certificate to be present at time of check-in. It is not recognized as a required travel document. So if that answers the question.
Yeah, I think it does answer Ben's question. So standard practice does not include this
how do you get other
unabridged
countries to
document.
understand?
I think we have to emphasize that it's not a question of people getting a birth certificate or whatever documents to apply for a passport or whatever. They have to have it physically with them all the time for every trip. And
so when they go to that exit point, they have to be able to demonstrate, here is the unabridged certificate. Is there a fee involved in that unabridged certificate?
Sure. I wish we had the representative from the Department of Home Affairs here, because he would be able to answer that question. But yes, I think there's normal processing and administration fees involved. On your point of the backlog, I've got clients that have been waiting since last year when the regulations were originally promulgated. So they were promulgated in May 2014. Then they were delayed until September. Then there was a complaint that there was a backlog. They were again delayed. Now they're finally coming into effect on the 1st of June. When they originally were promulgated, people started applying for unabridged birth certificates, and people are still waiting for unabridged birth certificates.
So quite a long process, because I suppose most of us would have abridged birth certificates, and we're probably not even aware that it's not the full thing. But we tried to get the representative from Home Affairs to give us more insight into this, because Megan, from your understanding, what is the objective? What were the objective for these changes from your understanding? Of course, you can't speak for them, but what are they meant to achieve?
So from what I've read and what I can understand, it's meant to protect children in South Africa and children offshore from being child trafficked. And they definitely do serve a purpose. It also assists us in instances of parental abduction, because that is a very real problem in South Africa, where divorcing parents or separating parents are leaving the country with children without the consent of the other party. So the thought behind it is good and it's needed, but the implementation just doesn't make sense.
I mean, I think back to the abduction and the single parent issue, what does it really mean in terms of single parents and the choices that they're facing when they're registering births, for instance? Is this something they have to consider?
Yeah, this is most definitely something that people are going to have to take into consideration. I just want to draw your attention to it's recently been published that in South Africa the norm is a single parent female household. So that is now the norm, not a married, normal nuclear family as such. It's a single parent female household. This means that when women have children, they're going to have to seriously consider whether or not they include the dad on the birth certificate. Because if you include him on the unabridged birth certificate, you're going to need his consent every single time you want to leave the country with the child or come back into the country with the child. So it could be a motivating factor not to include dads. That would then put unmarried dads at a disadvantage because mom could just up and leave with the child without any permission, any consent, without him even knowing about it. So it is definitely something that people are going to have to consider at the time that the child is born.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. Someone was saying on Twitter that it's difficult enough to get maintenance orders, never mind a whole consent process.
Precisely. Now you must track the person down. You must find them. We know of, I'm sure we all have friends and colleagues who have had children with people that they're no longer in contact with at all. And now you're going to be tied to them for the rest of your life. And if they want to be difficult, they can.
And every time you go on a trip, it's a new document. It's a new affidavit
Exactly.
The
stating.
affidavit is only valid for 4 months.
Yeah. So you've got to constantly be getting that new documentation. On Twitter as well, we had a comment from Lee Ngoma who said, and kind of playing into what the idea or the purpose of this documentation is, or the new legislation. She says, I guess these are protective measures even as much as they are an inconvenience for parents. But then you have to ask the question, how well thought through was this in terms of, we have an agenda as Home Affairs in terms of trying to clamp down on child trafficking or unauthorized movement of children, which is a very, I would argue, fair reason to look at the legislation. And then what's practical and what's good for the tourism industry, and that's really the question we're looking at today.
Yeah, it seems like almost the unintended consequences, like what you were sketching, that the law tries to ensure that you don't have child abductions within couples, but then the incentives are such that in the first place you won't include the father and therefore, make it more difficult.
Make your movement easier without having to get his consent. And make it more difficult for him to have any control over the child. So it is most definitely going to have unintended consequences that are going to be very negative.
Yeah, and I mean, you've spoken about families where it's a single mother, she may not be in contact with the father of the child any longer, but also you think about households where grandparents play such an important role, where they're basically the custodians, the guardians of children. How are they going to be able to travel? If you are living in South Africa, you're the grandparent of a child who has another parent who's in Zimbabwe or Botswana or Mozambique, it's going to become very difficult suddenly to get across a border to go and visit family just over the road.
And that's massively prevalent in South Africa. We have a lot of grandparents raising children, not only because of our HIV/AIDS epidemic, but because of migrant labor essentially and people working offshore. But in that instance where grandparents are traveling, you're going to have a court order granting you guardianship. And
That's right.
Court orders are extremely expensive to obtain, and guardianship can only be granted by the High Court. So you can't get it in the Magistrates Court or the Children's Court. You actually have to physically apply to the High Court to get guardianship rights of the child.
And then I imagine there would be legal fees involved.
Absolutely.
And it's the time as well, and it's suddenly a ripple effect in terms of booking flights or bus tickets or whatever, and perhaps the people who most need to travel, and on the cheap might not be able to do so now because there's all this administration involved.
Exactly.
And I think we assume that traveling is a middle class or an upper class issue, but it wouldn't be affecting people coming in and out from Lesotho, Botswana, Zimbabwe.
It's people going home to into Africa.
So our families are dispersed, migrant labor. But coming back to that question, I think Matthew, you were saying some of the countries that are high growth markets for South African tourism are the rest of Africa, China, India. How are they coping with with this regulation?
Well, from the information that I've researched and from a couple of colleagues I've spoken to, they're relying on the inbound tour operators here to provide them with this kind of information, and then the Department of Home Affairs has set up, as I said, those I don't know what you would call them, I forget their name, but offices where the visa office, for example, and they now form part of the visa requirement. So you would, like when South Africans travel to Europe, you would apply for a visa, and in that now you have that kind of information put into the required documentation. And then obviously the difference is now you have to travel with the required documentation. But like I was saying to you before the show started, I was at a meeting this morning with a colleague from a Mauritius hotel group to talk about our normal business meeting. And he slid his phone across the table to me and he said to me, "Have you seen this?" And what he showed me was all of the new requirements for people traveling to South Africa. I mean, he's from Mauritius, SADC region, and he said, "I'm coming here with father and sons going on a safari." So there's 12 passengers, 6 dads, 6 sons. And he said, "If I have to do this again, I'm not coming back. I'm going to Namibia." Mm-hmm. And that is a true example of the risk, the inability to, I believe, inability of government departments to collaborate together to make sure that you implement something that can be implemented and still meet the requirements of a good law, of something that is good, that we do want to do. But it's the implementation is just, it will make people go to other places. I mean, why would you want to come if he said to me, in Mauritius, to get an affidavit, you have to go to court. It's not like you go to the police, there's no commissioner of oaths. Now that's Mauritius. I don't know about, China or India, but there will be significant negative developments in the near future if.
And you think about the fact that the Minister of Tourism, Derek Hanekom, recently spoke about anticipated job creation in the tourism sector. And suddenly you wonder if we're going to lose a large chunk of our travel kind of contingent because people can't come into the country easily if they have children. What does that mean for those jobs we're hoping to create in tourism? Just to come back to social media, we had a question from Horizontal Latitude, that's the name of the account, and it says, will South Africa be able to host continental or international youth events in the future following new visa rules? Great question. If you have a large contingent of high school students, maybe, young people who are coming here to do an exchange of some kind.
So I was looking at that this morning because somebody asked me at the office, what about school groups? We do a lot of school groups to Mauritius, to island destinations, and coming in. And I was trying to look at which one that falls in. So in other words, the teacher becomes the guardian.
And how do you get a court
Now
order guardianship to?
I mean, that's a lot of paperwork. That I'm assuming that would be.
It falls through the gap.
Yeah, how does that work? It's an unaccompanied minor, but it isn't because there are adults traveling with the group. Now they would theoretically be the guardian, so you would have to go through the process. Each parents of each child
would have.
Then you'll have one single parents, and now you're just combining everything into one trip.
It's a coordination nightmare.
And I pity the travel agency that has to do that booking because I don't actually, as I sit here, have a very.
Well, it's not actually it's not clarified in the regulation. What do you do if the child's traveling with no parents and not with a guardian, legal guardian, which is ordered by the court?
Well, then under the law, I suppose you couldn't because there's
no
provision.
Documentation, I suppose. You could come with affidavits from both parents. I don't know.
You can try. But whether or not the airline is going to let you on the plane because they think you've complied,
this is the sad thing,
we don't know.
I think airlines and travel operators will tend to be conservative and say if they don't understand the documentation or they don't understand the law and they want to err on the right side, they will just say, sorry, you can't get on.
Exactly.
And
well, sorry to interrupt you. That's not entirely correct because a travel agent will still do the booking.
Of course, I suppose they still
That's
get the
the
money.
problem because it's the client's, the onus is on the client, the consumer, the traveller, to go and get the documentation, and they will be informed of what documentation according to what's out there. It's their responsibility to get that documentation, and if they don't, they will. 1st of June, if you rock up and you don't have your documentation, you lose all your money.
Yeah, I see Matthew protecting himself then saying,
but I am because I would say to people, we are really concerned about the future of as a tourism industry of our livelihood because there's a massive. I think Derek Hanekom said that 1 in 10 people are employed in the tourism industry in this country. I think 9.6% of the GDP came from tourism, or 10%, and 10% is employed in tourism, and 9.6% last year came from gross domestic product. That's more than mining. You can go check the numbers. Now that's huge. I mean, that's important for this country. You know, tourism is a future, and you can have a very quickly negative effect on that. And then how do you bring it back?
We'll pick up on that after the 2-minute break. We're just going to take a 2-minute break, but we'll continue the conversation online, and we'll pick up on the tourism issue once again after 2 minutes. New visa regulations for minors come into effect in June.
For a child to apply for a passport, there must be a consent of both parents, even just to have a passport. But in addition now, once that child now has to travel, he must carry now his or her unabridged birth certificate. You will recall that an unabridged birth certificate has got the details of both parents if the child is born out of a married couple. If it is not, it will be that one parent. So it means now if the parent now is traveling with the child, we look at an unabridged birth certificate, we look at the passport of the parent, and we are happy. But in the event that that parent is not able to travel with that child, then he or she must give a consent for the child to travel out of South Africa, but with somebody else, not just a child of that age just traveling alone.
Some commentators have warned that the strict regulations, which include the need for an unabridged birth certificate for minors, will chill movements in and out of the country.
Ebola, terrorism, and xenophobia have led to slow tourism growth on the African continent. That's the word from the industry, which says the South African government has put even more strain on travel stakeholders with new legislation.
We are worried, and so we are in dialogue with our sister department, the Department of Home Affairs, and there are other departments affected as well. We want to contribute towards the global effort to combat human trafficking and child trafficking in particular, but we need to do it in such a way that it doesn't have unintended negative impacts on our tourism flow, if you like.
This might seem like a very specific issue, but with South Africa's relationship to the rest of the world coming under scrutiny, we probe what these changes to immigration rules mean for business and tourism into South Africa. We were just talking about the impact of all of this on tourism. And I think, on our site on eNCA.com, we'll try to have as much of the clarification documents, the regulations that apply so that people can familiarize themselves with it, because it's a new thing. It's happening in 2 weeks' time. It might take people by surprise. And as you say, you're only grappling with some of the clarifications now as we speak. So we'll try to have as much of that on eNCA.com as possible. But before we even go back to the tourism point, I'm just curious about one thing. Do you think all of this does make the country safer in terms of either trafficking or, those sorts of crimes? Because I think sometimes we forget about the other side of the coin and what's happening to children.
I don't think so. It's just the same argument as if you outlaw guns, only outlaws are going to have guns. So people that are going to do underhanded things are going to do them in any event. And what's to stop somebody faking an affidavit if they're going to be fraudulent in the process? So they're not the correct measures to be put in place. But what else can the government do?
I think it probably raises the question on how trafficking is currently conducted. You know, if it's done officially and it's done, you know, through flying children on planes or putting them on buses and they're getting through border posts or whatever in that way, then maybe yes, there is an argument. But you would have to, and one would hope that the Home Affairs Department has researched this is how trafficking is conducted, therefore these measures are a good way of clamping down on that. And maybe that's something to, that's a question that a Home Affairs official who was around could answer, but they're not here. So.
I mean, I suppose there is the famous example that everyone keeps raising about the kids who were going to join ISIS, apparently, and they were traveling on their own, and the argument has been made that they wouldn't have done so had these regulations been in place. Is that fair enough?
Again, what's to stop them faking an affidavit from their parents?
Okay, so you're saying someone who's really determined to get out across the borders will find a way.
Where it will help and where I'm seeing it in my practice is with children that are being taken out by parents, so parental abduction, because that's going to be a hell of a lot more difficult to do, and it's going to be a bit of a more difficult hurdle to overcome for, let's say, a parent that wants to skip the country with their child. They're going to think twice.
And that's certainly an advantage.
Yes.
I mean, that's a pro to the new visa regulations. But is it a strong enough argument to kind of put pressure on a very important industry? That then becomes the question.
Yeah, I can't tell you. There are already mechanisms in place for instances of parental abduction. So where a child is taken by one parent overseas, you can launch what's called a Hague application to have the child returned to South Africa or to its country of origin, but only if the child is taken to a signatory country. So certain countries are not signatories to the Hague, and there's various requirements that have to be complied with. And generally, those applications do work and are effective, but they cost money and they take time, and it is obviously reactive rather than proactive, and I think that the government's trying to be proactive in this instance.
Yeah, I suppose when the child's already in a non-signatory country, God knows what could happen. And in a sense, I suppose it's a balance. This is, in a way, strengthening those people who are very much advocating for fathers' rights, or even, you know, of rights of people who are separated to have access to the child, but making lives of single parents more difficult. So I think it's a difficult balance that one would have to look into. Now, you know, if you think about it, you're in the travel industry. If you had to think of an alternative way of doing this, what would you recommend? You know, given similar objectives in mind, like we want the country safe, and
you know,
we don't
that's
want
not one I
minors in
really
trouble.
studied for, because you know, to be quite honest with you, I think, and maybe it's not something I made very clear in the beginning, I think the travel industry has never actually said this is a bad thing. You know, if you listen to all the panels and that, everybody was saying, very good idea, agree with it. The problem is, it's the implementation. You cannot, you're dealing with a department that is inconsistent and incapable of being consistent, and it affects business. So how do you improve it? You have to improve the service of a department like the Department of Home Affairs.
But that's big. That
is, but that's,
change
I mean,
everything,
now how do you
everything.
change it from it? I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think if I went into any travel agency, the 28-year-old consultant behind the counter would say, just do away with it.
Yeah.
It makes it easier. But that you know, because what is the alternative to ensure? I mean, I think...
Would you say maybe holding it off for longer? Though I guess maybe it didn't help in this
Well,
case.
they held it off since it was supposed to come in on the 1st of October. And there was an uproar because there was no process or consultation. It just kind of hit us. And then they said, well, you've got till 1 June. And that, people have been informed. I truly believe people have.
People within the sector
yeah,
or the general public?
Well, if you had gone into a travel agency, and I'm talking about a reputable travel agency, I can't speak on behalf of non-ASATA or you would have been given that information and said, on the 1st of June, this is what's coming in. But it wasn't very clear. It wasn't like a document like I got yesterday.
Yeah.
It was a bit bitsy. And then you would have to then go and find out from the visa department overseas, for example, what was required.
This is the thing. When we travel, we always think about the requirements overseas of getting in. So you look at that, you get the visa, and then you assume that getting out of the country is just what you do, your natural right with your children. You don't think about the requirements for getting out of the country.
Well, exactly.
And I think maybe this is something we have to be more informed about, that, it's not just about whether you'll be received on the other side, but whether you'll be let out on this side, which is
and
is
then
a
also
switch,
that difficulty of, you pitch up at a gate at some airport with your children, flustered probably because you haven't packed in time or whatever, and now you've got passports and you've got tickets, and then you have to have a whole dossier of additional documentation. I mean, practically, it's just making things more difficult. We had a follower on Twitter who said, for example, on suggestions on how to kind of make this work better, if Home Affairs assists on this bureaucracy, why don't they simplify paperwork by putting parents' details in a child's passport? So actually making some kind of accommodation within the document or the item of a passport that incorporates this new legislation in a streamlined way.
Well, sorry to interrupt you, but I think I mentioned to you that earlier. In order to get a passport for a child, you require an unabridged birth certificate now. I've just done it. I've been through that.
So then that's a given.
Apparently short process, which was very long, just so you know.
Oh, okay.
And I've personally seen the chaos of people queuing for unabridged birth certificates. The queue is out the door. So you can go and apply for the unabridged birth certificate and also get the passport at the same time. But you can't get a passport without an unabridged birth certificate. So it stands to reason that surely, if they're issuing the passport by having seen it, there could be a way of incorporating it. But again, the problem is you can sort that out in South Africa. But what do you do for the Frenchman with his family? What does he do? What is the document? What's the equivalent document in each and every country? Where nowhere in any other country has it ever stated that you need, it says birth certificate. Unabridged is such a, people don't know what that means.
It's a foreign concept. There was talk last year, sorry to interrupt, but there was talk last year of doing away with the abridged certificates completely and only issuing unabridged birth certificates to children. And I just don't think Home Affairs was up to it, and it hasn't changed.
Yeah, that sounds like a simple way, in a way, going forward of solving this. Like, don't give people, documentation that is not competent for everything they need to do. So just give them the full thing in the first instance, and then they'll be able to manage this. Yeah. And perhaps even this scenario, maybe in 5 years' time, we won't be having the same conversation when people know the backlog has been dealt with. But I suppose it's unfair in the short term to punish those who are almost guinea pigs, I suppose, of this system.
Well, some people have booked over a year in advance. I'm talking about holidays specifically. And they stand to lose a lot of cash if they don't get these documents. And those are the people that are, they're asking us, what happens? And we don't know. I mean, according to the rules, you're not going.
Do you know what happens if you're booking your whole trip online and you're not seeing a travel agent?
So that's what's interesting is, and you said earlier, I'm like got to protect yourself a bit. But the problem is that we're obliged. We have contracts with around the world with hotel groups and all. Now they don't. It doesn't say subject to your client getting his necessary travel documents. If he can't get it, we won't charge you. So you pay up, and you often pay ahead of time to get a specific deal. And there's lots of that happening where if you pay 6 months in advance, you pay less, and all of that happens. You've now paid, and your terms and conditions are clear. If you get within 3 weeks or 4 weeks of travel, in many cases your ticket may not be refundable, or your accommodation, and the hotel still bills the travel agent or the tour operator if they're the ones responsible for the payment. So, and they can understand a bit, maybe they make concessions if you have a good relationship with the hotelier, but, how many concessions can you make? And an airline is responsible, and the same rule applies. If you get to an airport and you don't have a visa, if that airline flies you to the country of destination and you arrive and you are not admitted into the country, the airline cover gets fined, and has to cover the costs of repatriation.
Sure.
So now that applies for people who don't have the necessary travel documents in the country of departure. So
I
in
have
South
to
Africa,
ask then, how many fines are going to be
well, I
taken
don't
out
know.
on the 1st of June for airlines in South Africa, or the flying into South Africa?
I think
Well,
that's
they won't let them board.
Yeah, they're
sorry.
not gonna
They
let
won't
them
let them
board.
board. That's the point. The airline will just not let them board. They won't
they
even
can't
have
take
a
that
debate.
risk.
Sure.
Okay.
But I personally think that if people have applied, also if you've booked a trip of some sort in the last year, there should be a moratorium of sorts placed on your ability to travel in the next year. Because when the regulations came in May last year, nobody knew about them. I was telling clients about it and they were saying, what are you talking about? Only now is it starting to sink in, and only now are people applying for unabridged birth certificates, and we have no idea what the backlog at Home Affairs is like. So Home Affairs needs to clarify what is the backlog, how long is it going to take. It does not take 6 weeks, as we are told, and only once that is cleared can this come in.
Yeah, so you think a moratorium, in a way, we'll see 1st June what happens. In a sense, they can still go ahead with the legislation, not have to change the regulation, but give even more time, especially for those who've already committed to certain plans to ensure that.
Or for
they're
instance,
not
if you can show
penalised.
proof of your application for the unabridged birth certificate but you haven't received it, then you should be
Yeah, I
allowed to
mean-
travel.
So there's like a grace period.
You know, if you're not allowing them to travel because a department of government is not complying, you are essentially prohibiting somebody's rights to movement. So it's unconstitutional.
Do you think we'll see challenges of that nature in the
I'd be
courts?
quite keen to challenge it, to tell you the truth, because how do you challenge somebody's rights to movement due to something that's not their fault or something that's out of their control?
Isn't it, in a sense, is this law, it sounds like it's being applied retrospectively. Is that what's happening here, or would they argue no?
No, it's not
Okay.
going to be applied retrospect. So it came into effect, or it was promulgated in May, but it's only going to come into effect on 1 June. So only people traveling from 1 June will be affected.
Okay, but I ask it from the point of view of the birth certificate. So when it wasn't a norm to have unabridged birth certificates, can't we say those people who were born when it wasn't the case, but who are still minors, should be let through because, well, their parents didn't have that option at the time?
We've always had the option to get unabridged birth certificates, but people just didn't know about it. South Africa's always done unabridged birth certificates.
Okay, so it's just that it
It's
wasn't
just a foreign
culturally the
concept.
norm to get it,
Exactly.
and you probably didn't need it, so you didn't.
And if
do
you
it.
if there was a birth and you were handed the abridged certificate, you just kind of took it and that was that. It's only now that you know you need it for a purpose that maybe people will come to realize, oh, we've got to get one.
Or you got it when you had to get a passport for your child, as Matt was saying, but have subsequently lost it or discarded it because the only reason you needed it was to get the passport. Now you've got to reapply.
It does. It's a bit of an you have to be administratively sus to get all of this correct and have it all the time. And also in death situations, having death certificates all the time with you. It's quite. It's not an easy thing, I think, for most people to do. But well, we'll just get the information out there and hope people engage with it and understand it.
And on the death certificate thing, if both parents are deceased, you need permission from the Director General of Home Affairs to travel. How do you go about getting that?
Hopefully
So-
Home Affairs has the answer. Yeah. On what you were saying, Trudy, about the kind of hurdles people are going to have to go through and the understanding that people are now going to have to develop around this legislation. I was impressed looking on social media how many travel accounts, how many accounts for embassies have been sort of dispersing or dispensing the information rather than the Department of Home Affairs. So I know the Department of Home Affairs has this booklet which kind of explains in simplified terms, this is what this means for traveling with children. But you do see a lot of rallying from people within the industry of tourism, travel, and then also, the UK embassy in Zambia, for example, in South Africa. Those Twitter accounts are sharing the information to try and warn people, be prepared, 1st of June, you've got to have all this paperwork ready or you'll just be barred
That's
from
our
traveling with the
livelihood.
child. Yeah.
As I said earlier, it's in our interest to help the travellers get, if they have to get it. We want them to get it because it's just not good for our business.
The one question I would have is around the education of officials who are at border posts. You know, suddenly you have to know what 6 different countries, or 60 different countries' unabridged birth certificates or their equivalents look like. So you're standing checking passports. It's something you've maybe done in your job for a good 5-10 years. Now suddenly you're having to go, okay, this is what the Chinese unabridged birth certificate looks like. This is what the Japanese one does, and the Zambian one, and whatever. It sounds like a lot of loopholes and hurdles.
Or even what does a formal affidavit properly commissioned look like? Or what does a court order look like? Granting full parental rights and responsibilities, or a guardianship order. It's a massive, massive mess.
So it's a lot of education that will have to be done, even, I suppose, with the officials. Well, let me put you on the spot then. Would you say we should get rid of all of these travel restrictions, even visas into South Africa? There are countries like Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, where South Africans can go without a visa and without much documentation. Is that a viable option for us?
I don't think so. I think we need some policing, especially with South Africa being sort of a hub for people to flee to. So with our illegal immigrant problem, I think it does need to be policed. But this, I think, is logistically challenging for us, and we're not properly equipped to deal with it.
Okay, you're the travel expert. Do you think we should just open our
borders? We would love not to have to arrange visas and that. It's costly, difficult. I mean, it's a nightmare in every client. I mean, without a fail, every country is different, you know, especially for South Africans travelling abroad. However, I think that visas play an important role, like Megan said. But you have to make sure that the visa requirements and the need for the visa and how it gets issued is in line with best practice internationally. And so that means, you know, if you apply to the UK for an visa or some Schengen country in Europe, it's kind of stock standard, the information that you need, passport, all of that, you know, travel documents, that kind of thing. We're not in line with best practice.
Are we more
in this
rigorous?
case? This is if this implementation is the most rigorous. No, but there is not another. I challenge anyone to find any other country that requires you to present yourself with an unabridged or an equivalent type document at the point of check-in, whether you need a visa or not. And the visa issue is very serious. If you look, I think I was listening recently to one of the news channels where there's a huge issue with Kenya and South Africa with regards to visas at the moment. We instituted a visa protocol where there was a cost now for Kenyans to come. The Kenyan government a couple of months ago turned around and then instituted a visa cost, and it's kind of on hold, and even the president of Kenya has mentioned that as an issue for trade and commerce. And you know, so it's a very I would say take a step back and look at collaborating with the right departments and making sure that whatever you put in practice is going to work for the best interest of the country from a legal standpoint, but I mean from an economic point of view, it has to drive more clients, travellers into the country and out.
Well, speaking just so as a tourist, I would, in my personal capacity, if I wanted to go on a safari to South Africa and I wanted to go on a safari full stop and I was from the UK, I would rather go to Botswana. So you're going to go to the place that's the easiest to get into.
Competitive space, you just the path of least resistance.
And sorry, that birth certificate, that unabridged birth certificate, when I was at Department of Home Affairs and I went to collect passports, the guy took it out of my hands and walked off. I almost had a heart attack. I was like, you cannot take those 2 pieces of paper. Those are the most important pieces of paper I have in my house. You know, it's like, mate, people, you're so anxious. That stuff is like, it's gold.
Yeah.
You guys,
travel is gold. You can't let it go. What you were saying though on the industry, I mean, there are sort of intermediary companies that do visa applications and escalate visa kind of processes and whatever. Do you think this is a potential window for business in that branch of tourism?
Well, overseas I can't comment. I don't know what happens in those countries. But in South Africa, I don't know. You have to appear in person, I think.
Now you do, yeah.
So, you know, there are these companies that are offering these services. I can't see how they're legit because you have to.
Unless they're chaperones, they take you there.
Well, I think that's what's
That's all
happening
they
because I
do.
did notice
Yeah.
some special cues forming.
Okay.
It's, you know,
So there's potential
you've
kind
got to
of
be there.
business
It's,
in
they
that.
do all of the fingerprinting, biometrics
Yeah.
now.
Yeah,
You know,
there's
so
no
so that's not an
privacy
issue. I don't have an issue with that. I think that those things are vital, but you know, it's got to be done. It's got to be better thought out.
Proportionate, I suppose,
Yeah.
with where we are. Well, we have to leave it there. Our time is up, but I think it's been a lively discussion, and hopefully we've addressed some of the questions and issues that our online audience had, and we'll also present some of that on our website on eNCA.com. So thank you very much for your insights. I think we all agreed we need some form of regulation. We have to protect our borders, but it has to be proportionate to the country's circumstances. That's it for this week's online debate. The conversation continues online at #eNCALive, and you can find more information about this on www.enca.com. See you next week, Tuesday.